and yell down at the devil and be like, screw you, man. I do what I want. Yeah. Moving on. Hello, welcome to Sound and Fury Book Reviews. As usual, I am Tina. Today I am doing a classic sci-fi book review of City by Clifford Simak. So this is a book from 1952, and a foreword is in it from 1976. So this is a science fiction. It's post-apocalyptic in a sense, and it's from Ace Books. There's some wild dogs wandering around here. Come here, Ruger. Come here, buddy. Okay, so this is Ruger. I'll show you him. This is Ruger. He's a good boy. I'm going to feature him in this video because the book is about dogs. So, he's a good boy. Yes, he's a good boy. He's a good boy. The problem is, he's too big for me to have it on my lap. And then my other little pug, he won't sit on my lap for more than like 2 seconds. So, anyway, there's my dogs for you if you were ever curious as to what these noises were that are going on in the background all the time in my videos. It's usually them. Okay, so as usual, I'm going to do a spoiler-free review that's kind of rambling. I'm going to talk a bit about the technology, and then I'm going to do a deep dive into the novel's themes and some amusing dated aspects of the story. These things aren't even really spoilers, so I think you can pretty much watch this whole review without spoilers. So, this is a hard book to review, actually, because it requires a lot of balance. It's both a story and not a story. It's a post-apocalyptic, but not in the same sense that we're used to. And it has some dated aspects, as I said, which is to be expected. So, I try not to, rate the book based on these things because of the time period, unless they're, particularly egregious. And there's nothing in this book that is that egregious. Overall, did I like the book? Yes, I did. It was really interesting. Was it an action-packed romp? No. Was it character-driven? Not at all. It's interesting. I guess it's interesting, or to me at least, as a piece of reactionary art from a very specific time period. It's a thought experiment almost, and a warning. This novel would be entirely different were it written today, and that's fine. That's why I find old school science fiction so interesting, because it's so specific often to when it was created. So from the foreword and from what we know about the 1950s, it's obvious Simak was attempting to wrestle with the changing world around him. He was worried about not just nuclear devastation, which is legit, but a society that he saw as slowly stultifying into uselessness. At least that was my take on the book. Simak himself lived from 1904 to 1988. He sounds like the cutest old man ever. I have a quote from him. He said, Denny has appeared. He's basically an old man, so I can picture him saying the same thing. I have been happily married to the same woman for 30 years and have 2 children. My favorite recreation is fishing the lazy way, lying in a boat and letting them come to me. Hobbies: chess, stamp collecting, growing roses. So that's basically my grandfather minus the chess. Simak's work tended to be more thoughtful than pulp, and honestly, there's not much else to talk about. He was a pretty normal guy. No controversies and stuff. So, City is set up as 8 small stories that are self-contained but carry a plot showing changes on Earth between 1991 and 12,000 years in the future. The idea is that dogs and robots are all that's left on Earth after most humans have gradually left the planet to cultivate other worlds. The big idea of the book is that human nature is violent and whether that violence has a purpose or not. It's not quite deep, but it's interesting. It's more interesting to me given his comments in the foreword about his reaction after the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in World War II. It's fascinating to me, and I really wish I'd asked my grandparents what they thought about it, given they were alive during this time. Actually, my grandma is 91, and she's still around, so goal for Christmas, ask Grandma about World War II. Anyway, so the plot, though, in this novel, it's not entirely there. It's less about a continuous story than instances or impetuses to change certain junctures of human development. We have stories set on Earth, one set on Jupiter, and then a final story about sentient ants in parallel universes that gets a bit off track. That being said, the tone and overall conceit of the novel is very consistent, easy to unpack. The characters are very bland, repetitive people, though. Most from the same family, that's how the stories connect. And the only one with any sort of personality is Jenkins, and that's the robot butler that serves the family and then guards the house for 12,000 years. And even he has less of an arc than just a constant presence in the story. There's also a whole side plot about mutant humans that gets a bit of detail, but not enough to make it kind of really interesting. We don't learn enough about anyone to really care for them either. But then again, this is a book from the 50s where people tended to be a bit bland, like, in novels. I mean, this is pre-postmodernism. And it's also a 12,000 year long story. So basically, you don't read this novel for a thrilling story or to cry at the human experience, but to think about concepts like human nature, whether violence is ever justified, and are we still people if we leave our planet? I mean, we're still people, I guess. Are we still Earthlings if we leave our planet? Overall, definitely worth checking out, but it's very dry and very slow paced. Be prepared for that. I did like it though, and I know it's a very popular one, so I hope you give it a chance. So I'm going to talk about some of the technology in the book because it's always fun to look at, 1950s perspectives of what technology will be in the future. So on the first page, a man's grandson settles down to a Twitch session. I was like, okay, obviously that's not what we know that is now. I looked it up, on Google, and I can't find any explanation of what this could be. It has something to do with a radio. I don't know if it means fiddling with a radio station, if it's just listening to music. If anybody, knows what this is, can you tell me? Because I'm really curious what a Twitch session was in the 1950s regarding radios. Another part of the technology is that the dogs are genetically modified somehow. It's not explained in any detail to speak. Yet they don't give them hands or thumbs, so the robots serve as their hands. It's like a weird kind of semi-symbiotic relationship. It's. I wish we'd gotten a lot more about that because I found that really interesting, and I was like, okay, how does this actually work? But we don't really, other than the robot like opening a door for the dog, we don't really see too much about that. So he basically predicts the internet and COVID living on page 50. And that was right. For what need was there to go anywhere? It was all here. By simply twisting a dial, one could talk face to face with anyone you wished. You could go by sense, if not by body, anywhere one wished. Could attend a theater or hear a concert or browse in a library halfway around the world. Could transact any business one might need to transact without rising from one's chair. So I thought that was pretty funny. He also suggests that this type of living creates a pandemic of agoraphobia, which I thought was also interesting. And I wonder, actually, psychologists or, researchers looking back on, 2020, 2021 will see whether some people did develop some kind of, issues with leaving their houses or whether it was the opposite. So interesting. Anyway, there is a gun in this book. One little gun. It's Grant stared in perplexity at the atomic gun. A handy thing, it performed a host of services, ranging from cigarette lighter to deadly weapon. Built to last 1,000 years, it was foolproof, or so the advertisement said. It never got out of kilter, except now it wouldn't work. I just like that you're like, oh yeah, here's my gun. I'm going to light my cigarette at my face with it. Like, what if you hit the wrong button? Like, it's so ridiculous, the concept. I loved it. And then there's another one. This is for all you writers out here. He's got a machine that translates his thoughts to the computer to write a book. So Webster put on the plastic thinking cap, snapped the button on the writer on his desk. Chapter 26, he thought, and the writer clicked and chuckled and wrote chapter XXVI. Okay, I mean, that was just a little tiny thing, but I thought that was interesting. There's also the whole story number 4, which deals with us people walking around on Jupiter. He creates this magnetic or metal composite suit so the pressure doesn't crush anyone. And there are bases on Jupiter too, which are domes made of this material. But, I mean, Jupiter's a gas giant. You can't walk on it. I just love the 1950s idea of what planets would be like. At least he knew there was higher gravity there. I mean, I'll give him that, but it's like, it's so funny. He's like, yeah, we can just walk around on Jupiter. You just need a special suit, so you don't get crushed by the pressure. It's like, yeah, okay. Okay, so there's some funny things about the novel that I want to point out. Most of these things are just kind of like funny now, 70? Yeah, 70 years later. So... There's this guy who's an enumerator who's basically a census taker. And this is like hundreds of years in the future by now. I don't remember what section this is, but so it's Grant again. Grant crossed the table where Jenkins had placed his pack. Loosening the straps, he opened it, brought out a thick portfolio. Back at the bed again, he sat down and hauled out sheafs of paper, thumbed through them. Records, hundreds of sheets of records. The story of hundreds of human lives set down on paper. It's like 300 years from now and he's like walking around with like a bunch of paper folders. It's so funny. I like how he can be like, yeah, we're going to have suits to walk on Jupiter, but there's no way to store data without actual physical paper. It's so interesting. All right. And I got one more. 2 more for you? No, 2 more for you. I hope you find these interesting. I think they're pretty funny. So here's one that I wonder what makes me wonder what Simak would think of social media, because he says, man's inability to understand and appreciate the thought and the viewpoint of another man would be a stumbling block which no amount of mechanical ability could overcome. That's pretty much Twitter and pretty much YouTube comments. Like, no offense, I don't usually get very bad comments on here, but then again, only a few of you watch me and I appreciate you guys. But yeah, I just think that that's so funny. It's like a perfect perfect explanation for why we can't be civil on social media. I got one more here for you. So in this scene, there's this weird creature and this guy approaches it. And I mean, there's this weird creature that shows up and everyone's like, oh my God. And this one man, so the man was almost on it, walking straight and upright, a man with puny body and ridiculous fists, and courage. Courage, thought Jenkins, courage to take on hell itself. Courage to go down to the pit and rip up the quaking flagstones and shout a lurid, obscene jest at the keeper of the damned. I love this. This is like apex predator energy. And this is how I'm going to approach like all aspects of my life from now on. I'm just going to be like, rip up a hole and yell down at the devil and be like, screw you, man. I do what I want. Yeah. Moving on. So I'm going to do a couple little critiques on 3 aspects of the story. And these little critiques are just kind of like interesting kind of, ways of assessing the story. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the story one's entire concept. Big ideas of the novel are fun to think about, but the nitty gritty of the story, especially the first one, isn't very fleshed out. In story 1, everyone has abandoned cities to live in the country. Okay, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, that's like what I want to do, at least sometime in the next 5 years. Race in general, including segregation in the United States, was not discussed. And he doesn't get into whether this is the case in other countries or how developing nations were affected by this like move from the suburbs. It's a very Eurocentric, white-centric story that I think would have been more interesting had he brought in these aspects and thought about how this would have impacted everybody in society, not just, people living in the suburbs. Then again, he was writing in the 50s, and it's not like he had social media like today, and there weren't even real studies on the makeup of cities based on racial lines. Retroactively, this book is lacking in reality, I would say, but looking at it from a 1950s suburban lens, okay, the idea is not improbable, and I can understand like what the point was. It's just like looking at it now, knowing what we know about how the makeup of cities are and how the demographics of cities worked, it doesn't seem like society would progress in that way. Like, it's very expensive to leave the suburbs and move to the country. So, and there's all these like abandoned suburbs that he talks about, and all these people that are like, oh, no one lives here anymore. But I'm like, then where are they living? Like, where? Not everybody just moves to the country. Like, where are they working? Like, I guess the whole thing was that people didn't need to work, but I'm like, how? Who's building these helicopters that everybody has? So it's not really fleshed out, but again, that's not really the point. It's more of like an overarching concept of society. So, it's fine. I just thought it was interesting to like be like, actually, I don't think it would go that way. Or it didn't. I'm going to talk about ladies for a minute because I always have to. So this book is painfully male. But at the same time, he does include women who are competent, unlike the typical like hysterical woman you often get at this time period. And he makes suggestions regarding a very slight shift in social gender roles that I was surprised to see. For example, there is one woman with a job in STEM, and I was very impressed with that detail. There's also another woman later on who is an artist, and then this detail about her life is dropped. There, he thought, there is the root of it. If the families had stayed together, if Sarah and I had stayed together. He rubbed his warts on the back of his hand, wonder if Tom goes by my name or hers. Usually they take their mother's name. I know I did at first until my mother asked me to change it. Said it would please my father, and she didn't mind. Said he was proud of the name he bore, and I was his only child, and she had others. I thought that was really fascinating, given the 1950s mentality about, the nuclear family and traditional gender roles. I was like, whoa, he suggests that maybe in the future people wouldn't, children wouldn't take their father's name. They'd take the mother's name. Oh my God. Oh my God. How could this ever happen? Anyway, I must add, though, that there are 3 women who speak the entire time in this book, and they don't contribute to the plot in even a minor fashion. Women aren't treated horribly at all in this book. They just aren't present. None of the robots or dogs identify as female either, which I thought was like just kind of like lazy. This is far, far preferable, though, to the novels that use women's deaths as impetus for male journeys, or books with unnecessary violence, because there's a lot of that in this time period, more so in the 60s and 70s. Anyway, so I don't have any issue with this book aside from it being laughably dated in certain aspects. And this is the last thing I'm going to talk about. So the Sentient Ants, this is the only kind of real spoiler in the final story, from the final story. So maybe skip this one if you intend on reading this book. So earlier on in one of the stories, I can't remember which one, this guy named Joe, he realizes that ants, when ants build their ant colonies and then hibernate, they forget how to build colonies. I don't know if this is true or if this is just some like 1950s science, but he discovers that if he puts like a warming thing over top of the ants' colonies, they won't hibernate. And then what this does is it causes the ants to remember how to do stuff, and then the ants eventually like develop into sentience. I don't think that's possible because there are ants in other countries where it's warm all the time and this doesn't happen. And they do have very, very big ant colonies, but it's not like they're doing it like the ants in his the ants he's talking about here aren't just building like massive ant colonies like you see in South America or in like other parts of the world. They're like smelting, and they have little furnaces, and they have like a little it's so cute. They have like a little society going on. Anyway, so in the year 1200 or 12,000, these ants are gradually like taking over the entire world with their ant colony, and Jenkins has to decide whether to kill them off or not because they're basically going to just destroy everything that's left. But Jenkins decides to let these sentient ants continue their massive ant colony because he doesn't want this cycle of violence that humans have finally gotten past to start up again. I mean, this entire idea is ludicrous, but at the same time, I understand why Simak would end on this note, that the hovering dust cloud of nuclear war pervades this entire novel. His point is that we humans, if we don't stop killing each other, we will kill everyone. Is he wrong? Probably not. Is it simplistic? A little, but it makes sense. And especially looking at the fact that he, witnessed, I mean, didn't witness, but he clearly saw footage of the aftermath of nuclear blasts in World War II. He is terrified, and I get it. So, interesting book. I do recommend this city. I think it's a really interesting book. You just have to be able to deal with, a very dry story, and you have to go into it expecting it to be more of a thought experiment in novel form rather than an actual like novel. Yeah, so have you read this novel? Do you like it? Do you think that the ants could develop sentience? Do you think that that we could eventually have domes on Jupiter? No. No. Thanks for watching.